We've been talking about that great cloud of witnesses that God has blessed us with from Hebrews chapter 11. We've looked at several of these already, and you'll remember that Hebrews chapter 12 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God." As we think about this great cloud of witnesses, we come now in Hebrews chapter 11 to verse 21. "By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff." I think there's two things here that are brought out about the life of this man of faith. He's one of the great cloud of witnesses, and he's there because he's a man of faith. All those in chapter 11 are mentioned because of their faith. And there are two specific things, I think, that are brought out by the Hebrew writer here about Jacob. Maybe three. But the two things that I want us to give notice to is, number one, that he blessed each of the sons of Joseph. Okay, Ephraim and Manasseh were Joseph's sons, and they weren't born in the land of Canaan. They were born in Egypt. And I think in this blessing that Jacob brings them into the family of God, that family that enjoys this special favor of God, into the congregation of Israel. And it makes no difference to him that they were born in Egypt. They're now going to be his sons. They're going to be a part of the Israelites, those descendants of Jacob. And when you think about that, he did that by faith. Did he think he was ever going to see his son again? No. And yet he not only got to see his son again, he got to see his grandsons and brings them into their great family. He says, "They are mine just like my own sons are mine." And he made them the heads of two different tribes, as if they had come right directly from his loins. And he prayed for them by faith, that they might both be blessed of God. He prophesied that they would be blessed and had faith that God would bring it about. And just as Isaac had done before, Jacob does again in his prophecy, and he prefers the younger before the older. And so Ephraim, even though Joseph places them that way, that the right hand of his father would be laid upon Manasseh's head, Ephraim is preferred. And again, the older does not get the blessing that the younger does, which is sort of coming full circle from Jacob's story. Many think that this is a foreshadowing of how the Gentiles were brought in to be just as glorious and more than God's chosen people, the Jews. And it is a visible representation of them being brought in the way Jacob brought Ephraim and Manasseh, born in Egypt, into the group. The second thing is that he worshiped leaning on the top of his staff. Did you notice how, as Genesis 48 began, it said that Joseph was told, indeed, your father is sick, and he took his sons. And Jacob was told, look, your son Joseph is coming to you. And look what he did. Israel strengthened himself and sat up on the bed. Now, if you go back to the end of chapter 47, where he's making Joseph take an oath here, it says, when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, now if I found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And he said, I'll do as you've said. And he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. So Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed. Now, in the Aramaic and in the LXX, the 50, the Septuagint, that word is staff. There's very little difference in the Hebrew between bed and staff, just a mark or two. And so the Septuagint has that he bowed himself on the head of his staff. And so we're left to see that the staff and the bed are involved. And so many feel like that what's trying to get put across here is that he needed his staff, he needed help to set himself up in bed. And you see, when he was told that Joseph was coming, he strengthened himself and sat up on the bed. So that is a part of what we're seeing here. He worshiped leaning on the top of his staff. He praised God for what God had done for him and for the prospect of what God was going to do. Again, it's all about faith, isn't it? That's why he's there. And he prayed for those that he was leaving behind, that the religion that he had and the relationship that he had with his God would be continued through his posterity. And he did this leaning on the top of his staff. I think that's put there to show us his physical condition at this time. He worshiped when worship came hard for him, when it was difficult. He would not leave worship alone just because it was difficult. Some of the papal drawings and pictures have Jacob's staff with some representation of Jehovah on it. I think that is blasphemy and sacrilege to the memory of Jacob. Jacob was not an idolater, he was a God-fearer. And even though he was not able to support himself as far as his body was letting him down, he used his staff and he strengthened himself and he worshiped his God. He would not let that be an excuse to neglect worship. Isn't that something? And I know that this worship took place right where he was, but it reminds me of, we have people that come here to gather with us to worship that their bodies have let them down and they just keep coming. And it's encouraging, isn't it? We would do well to take heed. Jacob was going to worship with his body as well as with his spirit. Even though he couldn't do it like he used to, it would not be an excuse. And we see his dependence on God, even in his frail old age. And when did he do this? By faith, Jacob, when he was dying. Deanne and I have talked several times about as you get older, it ought to be on your mind more and more that my time is very limited. When he was dying, Jacob acted in faith. He lived by faith all of his life. And now he was going to die by faith, and he was going to die in faith. Remember that beautiful statement? I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, "Right, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors and their works follow them." Jacob falls into that category. When he was dying, looked to the future. It wasn't about himself. He looked to the future of his family, and he looked to his God. And it ought to be that way when we come to die. That if we've lived a life of faith, we need to die a death of faith. In fact, faith has its greatest work to do when we are a-dying, doesn't it? I said to Nita the other day before I was leaving, I said, keep the faith. And she said, I'm going to try. And I just think about, how as we near the time of our transition, how important that faith becomes. We honor God by our patience, by saying, my body doesn't do what it used to do. I'm not able to enjoy the things I once enjoyed, but I'm going to be patient. I'm going to live in hope. I'm going to look to that future joy that you have prepared for me, Father. I'm not going to let that escape me. I'm not going to let the devil take that away from me. Jacob is a wonderful example of when he was dying, he took care of his spiritual business. The best way that parents can finish their course in this world is just the way Jacob did. Bless your families and worship your God. We have to admire the faith of the patriarchs, don't we? They didn't have the completed Bible, the completed Revelation the way you and I did. They couldn't look from Genesis to Revelation. You and I can. We have to admire the faith that they had with the limited knowledge that they had. They handed down God's promises that they'd been given from generation to generation. And we read about their failures, and yet even though they weren't perfect, they still become great models of faith for you and I. Oh, how you and I should ask to have that kind of faith. The faith that got them through with limited revelation, how much faith should you and I have? It reminds me of the statement that the disciples made when Jesus told them they ought to forgive 70 times 7. What was their reaction to that? Lord, increase our faith. There's an emphatic word there in Genesis 48, and we see it here, that he blessed each of the sons of Joseph. Some translations there say both of the sons of Joseph, but I think each kind of gets the point across, that one blessing for Joseph was not going to cut it. There was going to be a blessing for Ephraim and a blessing for Manasseh, because he had taken them in, and just like if we kept reading in chapter 49, there's all the blessings, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, right down the line. And he says, Ephraim and Manasseh are going to be right there with the rest of my children. I'm not just going to give one blessing to Joseph. That will not cut it. And so Jacob was not talking about some peculiar interest that he had in Ephraim and Manasseh. The father, the grandfather, became the prophet in offering these blessings. He laid his right hand on the head of the younger, and he knew what he was doing. And it was against the wishes of his son. And that has a point in and of itself too, doesn't it? When it comes to serving God, we have to do what God says to do. We have to do what's right, even when our family thinks it ought to be another way. We have to listen to God. Jacob knew nothing at the time in the way that Levi, the tribe of Levi, was going to be merged with some of the other tribes, and that it was going to leave a place for Ephraim to come in. But he did this in faith, because God led him to know that what he promised he would surely accomplish. He knew that somehow or the other, Ephraim was going to be magnified. And he said in the future, Israel, when they talk about blessing people, it will be a custom for them to say, may God bless you like Ephraim and like Manasseh. He had faith in that. Something that Joseph got in honor of Egypt was nothing compared to the honor that his father just bestowed upon his children who were born in Egypt. Isn't it amazing how God can exalt those who the world tries to humble? And so Ephraim becomes something that no one would have expected. This is an important event. Jacob is dying. In any circumstances, any case, death is an important and solemn event, isn't it? You know, that was what our lesson was about this morning. Yesterday, I caught a little bit of Rocky 3. Rocky 3, you know, they spend 1, 2, and 3 building up this wonderful relationship between Rocky and Mick, his manager. And they're so close, and you feel so much toward Mick by that time, you know, that you love him. And he dies in 3. And when I watched that scene where Rocky weeps over Mick, it just took me right back to when my own father died, because he'd become a father figure. It's a solemn time. And Jacob was a-dying. Think of what goes on at death, the things that go through our mind. There's all these questions about the spirit leaving the body, and we don't know what that's like. And Hades, and you know, we have very limited information about Hades, and you know, what do we feel and what do we see, and all that kind of thing goes through our mind. And all the things that come to an end at death. But for Jacob, think of all the things that were beginning. He was beginning that introduction to eternity. And death was solemn, and I'm sure there was a lot of sadness, but there was a lot of joy at the prospect of what Jacob was saying to his children about the future. And this interesting attitude, leaning on the top of his staff. You know, there's a statement made in Genesis 32 and verse 10 by Jacob. He said, I'm not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which you've shown your servant. For I've crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I've become 2 companies. Isn't that something? And I wonder, and you know, this was when he was going to meet his brother Esau, and he didn't know how Esau was going to receive him. He was a little scared about it, I think. And he prepared all these gifts to give to his brother to try to get back in his good graces. Turns out his brother had long forgiven him, I think. But did you notice that? I've crossed over this Jordan with my staff. Now remember, here in Hebrews, it tells us that he worshiped leaning on the top of his staff. I would suppose it's that same staff that he crossed the Jordan with, wouldn't you? You probably wonder why I brought this up here, right? This is my staff. But it wasn't mine originally. This was made by my dad. And if you knew my dad, and I'd encourage you to take a look at it after we're done tonight, you know he doesn't do anything halfway. This isn't a stick. It is a real staff. It's got finger grips here. And anytime we went to the woods, this is what he had. And down at the bottom, there's a couple marks carved in. And I asked him, what is that? He said, well, that's when you put it in soft ground. If it goes up to that second mark, you don't have any business going through it. And at the end, it's got a place that is flat. And I saw him tamp things with that. When he'd straighten a post or something, he'd tamp the ground with that, tamp it back in place. And so when he died and I saw this in the barn, I said, well, that's going to come home with me. And every time I go to the woods, I think about a lot of things that he taught me, and especially his woodworking ability. If you see, I mean, he whipped this thing out in no time, and it's better than I could do in a week. It reminds me of a lot. Now, my point is, I just wonder what Jacob was thinking as he leaned on the top of his staff. That staff had seen some things, hadn't it? I crossed the Jordan with this staff. And now I'm going to use this staff, the one that helped me as God guided me. I'm going to lean up on this thing, and I'm going to worship my God, even though I can't hardly get out of this bed. And I can't see anything. I don't even know who that is coming out there. I have to ask. I'm going to lean on this staff. You and I need a staff to lean on, and that staff is Jesus Christ. But we have people that help us, and we have events that bring Him to our minds. I wonder if he had that staff when he wrestled with the man until morning, and that angel put his hip out of joint. I wonder if he had that staff then, and that came back to his mind. And he's going to have that staff at the last scene of all, when he blesses his kids, blesses his grandkids, and thinks about going on to be with God. Blessing each of the sons of Joseph. And again, we go back to Genesis 48, verse 15. God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day, the angel who's redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. Let my name be named upon them, in the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. He blessed the lads. Leaning on his staff, he worshiped. Would that not have brought back some memories as he leaned on that staff and as he contemplated what God had done for him and offered these blessings? You know, unbelievers, they would look at what Jacob said and it wouldn't mean anything to them. But he had a powerful prayer that he prayed for his kids and his grandkids, and he, by faith, knew that God would bring it about. A lot of times, God blesses man by man, and He did that in the case of Jacob. He worshiped. God was a reality to him. You know, it's been so disappointing to me to see sometimes there will be somebody that comes and worships with you, and then something happens in their life, and they just give up worship. And you realize, well, worship wasn't really worship for that person, because if it was, this event couldn't take them away from God. You know, worship means to kiss the hand of, to offer the greatest thanks and respect and reverence for. We do that for God because we know who He is. There's no event in this life that ought to change that, is there? And when we're dying, we ought to be so determined, as Jacob was, we are going to worship. Faith in God is the secret to victory in life and in death. This verse just helps us to appreciate that Jacob knew his God and he had faith in what was going to happen in the future. Seeing that we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. When you see Jacob having to lean on his staff to worship God, doesn't that encourage you to get rid of any little thing that would keep you from worshiping? That's what the Hebrew writer is encouraging us to do. And I hope that these things will help us to strengthen our relationship with God and have the kind of relationship that Jacob had, and have it not just now in fair weather, but have it when we are a-dying. May God help us to have that kind of faith. If there's one here this evening and your life is not right with the Lord and you need to make it right, look to Jacob, look to Abraham and Isaac, look to Joseph, look to these patriarchs and see how they were determined, and let that be an encouragement to you to do whatever it takes to make your life right so that you're ready to meet the Lord. And if we can help you, pray for you, and strengthen you in some way, please let us know right now while we stand and sing.